Hey guys, so this week I'm going to read this biography of who was Walt Disney. This is by Whitney Stewart. Alright, so I'm going to read a few chapters each day just so we can learn who Walt Disney is. Alright, so our first one was, who was Walt Disney? Walt Disney liked being the class clown. He once said that he would do anything for attention. His schoolmates in Marceline, Missouri loved his performances. Once he caught a field mouse and made a leash for it out of string. He waltzed into class and paraded his new pet around the room. Somebody saw the little critter and screamed. Walt's teacher marched right over, put an end to the mischief, and punished Walt. But he didn't care. He and his mouse were famous for a day. Walt Disney didn't know it then, but one day another mouse, one named Mickey, would make him famous all over the world. Alright, Chapter 1, The Farm. On December 5th, 1901, Walter Disney was born in an upstairs bedroom of a 2-story cottage on North Trip Avenue in Chicago. Walt's father had built the house himself. Walt's mother, Flora, was trained as a teacher, but she gave up a career to raise her 5 children. She was as friendly and warm as her husband was short-tempered and stern. By the time Walt was 4, the neighborhood was growing rough, so the family moved to a farm in Marceline, Missouri. It was the happiest time in Walt's childhood. Walt loved his new home. Even though Marceline was a small town, it was still exciting for Walt to head down the main street with all of its little stores. Around the farm were weeping willows and apple, peach, and plum trees. Walt watched rabbits, squirrels, possums, foxes, and raccoons scurry around the pond. He liked to ride on pigs, even though he often fell off and landed in mud. And he and his friends trotted on Charlie, an old farm horse. Charlie charged through the trees without caring about his riders. Walt had to jump off to keep from bonking his head on a branch. Walt's parents and older brothers, Herbert, Raymond, and Roy, were too busy with farm chores to take Walt to school, so he didn't start until he was almost 7. But by then, his younger sister Ruth, who was 5, was ready for school, too. Walt said that starting school with his younger sister was the most embarrassing thing that could happen to a fellow. After school, Walt fished and skinny dipped. In winter, he went sledding or skating on a frozen creek. On Sundays, the Disneys visited neighbors. Sometimes Elias, which is his father, played fiddle. It was one of the few times he saw his father having a good time. Walt always wanted to entertain people to make them have a good time. Once, a group of actors came to town to perform Peter Pan. It was about a boy who never grows up. Walt loved the play and got to play Peter in his school's production of the play. His brother Roy hooked up wires to lift Walt into the air. To the audience, it looked like he was flying, but the wires broke, and Walt went flying into the surprised crowd. Almost as soon as he could hold a pencil, Walt spent hours and hours drawing. He told everyone that he was an artist. His proudest possessions were crayons and drawing paper from his Aunt Margaret. Walt definitely did have talent. His neighbor Doc Sherwood thought Walt was so good that he asked for a picture of his horse. The horse wouldn't stand still, and Walt had trouble drawing his portrait. But Doc Sherwood and his wife praised the picture. It made Walt very proud. Every drawing, even drawing, could get Walt into trouble. One day, he discovered a barrel of black tar. It was as soft as paint. He and Ruth dipped big sticks into the tar and drew pictures all over the side of their white house. Their parents were not happy when they saw the artwork. The tar wouldn't come off. Chapter 2. Newspaper Boy. Farm life was fun for Walt, but hard for his father. Elias couldn't seem to grow good crops. The family would never have enough money. Worrying made his father's temper worse, so Walt avoided him as much as possible. He was much closer to his gentle, smiling mother. When Elias became sick, Flora had no choice but to sell the farm. Walt was heartbroken about leaving. He started crying at the sight of a farmer buying the old colt that he and Roy had tamed. The colt whined at Walt. He ran after him and hugged him. Then the farmer led the colt away. Disney's next move was to Kansas City, where Elias ran a newspaper route for the Kansas City Times. Walt had to pitch in too. He started delivering papers at 9 years old. He had to get up every morning before sunrise. Sometimes he was so tired that he curled up in a doorway and fell asleep. When he awoke, he ran to finish his paper route and get to school. In class, Walt had a hard time paying attention. One teacher called him the second dumbest in her class. He often daydreamed or thought up ways to make his classmates laugh. He liked to draw funny characters on the blackboard. Or he'd draw an animal in the corner of the pages in his textbook. When he flipped the pages, the animal appeared to move. These were his first cartoons. Walt admired Abraham Lincoln. So one day he made a stovepipe hat out of cardboard. He put a fake wart on his cheek so he would look like Lincoln. Then he recited the Gettysburg Address for his class. The teacher loved Walt's act. He asked him to perform it for the other classes. That was fine with Walt. He liked showing off. Walt's best friend was also named Walt. He liked to perform too. The two Walts dressed up like the film comedian Charlie Chaplin and his enemy, the Count. They tried out their act in talent contests. One time they won a prize of 25 cents each. Walt's artistic talent earned him free haircuts from the local barber. Neighbors started going to the barber shop just to see Walt's newest picture on the wall. Walt loved this little bit of fame. At 15, Walt got to see more of the country. He had a summer job working on a train that traveled between Kansas City, Missouri, and Oklahoma. He walked up the aisle selling newspapers, candy, and soda, and chatting with people. Sometimes the engineer would let him ride in the coal car. For Walt, that was heaven. All his life, he loved trains. They carried you to new places, new adventures. All right. Chapter 3, Seeing the World. In 1917, once again, the Disneys had to move. The newspaper route wasn't bringing in enough money. So Elias decided the family should return to Chicago. There he invested in a fruit juice and jelly company. Maybe this time his luck would change. In Chicago, Walt attended McKinley High School. Once again, he was bored in all of his classes. The only thing he liked was drawing cartoons for the school newspaper. After a year, he dropped out of school. Even though he wasn't sure what he wanted to be, Walt had faith in himself. He was sure that one day he would be a big success. Maybe as a newspaper cartoonist, or maybe doing something in show business. At night, he took art classes in the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. He also bought himself a movie camera. He and a new friend, Russell Mamaeus? I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Maas? So he and a new friend made short films together. They worked out a comedy act, but it must have been pretty bad. When the boys tried to act out at a theater, they got kicked off the stage. To support himself, Walt applied for a job with the post office. The boss said he was too young, so Walt went home, changed his clothes, put on a man's hat, and drew a mustache on his face. There's a picture of the video camera. Then he went back to the post office, talked to the same man again, and this time he got the job. While Walt was working at the post office, two of his brothers, Herbert and Roy, were serving in the army. It was wartime, World War I. The United States had joined the fight against Germany and was sending thousands of American troops over to Europe. Walt felt as if he was missing out on all the action. To him, the war seemed like an adventure. But he was too young to enlist. Finally, he convinced his mother to sign papers to permit him to drive an ambulance. He set sail for France in November of 1918. He had not yet turned 17, but he was about to see a whole new world. The thing was, Walt never got near a battlefield. So here's the ambulance, and here's him going to interview for the second time. The thing was, Walt never got near a battlefield. To his disappointment, the fighting had already ended by the time Walt reached France. Instead of rescuing wounded soldiers, he spent much of his time driving officers around, running errands, and drawing. He drew cartoons all over the canvas flaps of the ambulance. Walt made extra cash in a dishonest way. He and a friend found some helmets of German soldiers. They scuffed them up and shot holes in them. Then Walt's friends sold them as real war souvenirs. Walt returned home a year later in October 1919. He was almost 18. His family hardly recognized him because he had grown so much taller. He had filled out and looked like a man. Walt was also hooked on cigarettes, a terrible habit he never quit. Elias Disney wanted his son to work in Chicago at the jelly factory, but Walt wasn't interested. Against his father's wishes, he decided to go back to Kansas City and find work as an artist. Walt Disney was ready to strike out on his own. That was chapter 3. All right, chapter 4. Drawings that move. What do you think is going to happen in this chapter? What are drawings that move? Do you know what those are called? A bunch of cartoons are like this. Animations, right. All right, chapter 4. In Kansas City, Walt teamed up with another artist. He had a very unusual name. Iwerks? Ub was shy and serious, not at all like Walt. Ub was also very talented. The two started their own company. They hoped to create art for ads and signs. They had plenty of ideas. They were missing only one thing: customers. The shop closed after only a month. So this is him. Soon after, Walt and Ub found jobs at the Kansas City Slide Company. It turned out to be a lucky break. The Slide Company changed Walt's life. He learned all about animation. Animation is a film of drawings that move. Cartoons. In 1920, cartoons were something new. Audiences were amazed to watch drawings of funny people and animals actually move on the screen. So, animation basics. An artist creates simple animation by drawing the same character over and over on separate pieces of paper. In each drawing, the position of the tail will be a little bit different. So this is a dog wagging its tail. When the pieces of paper are flipped really fast, to the human eye, the tail appears to be moving. For films, professional animators create the illusion of motion by recording the scene changes frame by frame. So here's the animation process, and here is where he worked. Artists competed with each other to invent new techniques for cartoons. Walt wanted to get in on the action, so he went to the library and took out a book called Animated Cartoons: How They Are Made, Their Origin and Development by Edwin G. Lutz. He studied the book. Then he set up a studio in the shed behind his house. Every evening he drew cartoon characters in different positions and filmed them. It might take 18 drawings just to show a person raising an arm. Animation takes a lot of time, but hard work never stopped Walt. He called his cartoons laughograms. They were silent, full of slapstick humor, and only lasted a couple of minutes. Some were based on fairy tales, but Walt would change the story a little bit to make it funnier. After selling a laughogram cartoon to the Newman Theaters in Kansas City, he started up a small company to make more. Walt recruited artists to help him make cartoons. After all, he couldn't do all of the drawing himself. The problem was he couldn't afford to pay a steady salary. Instead, he promised to share any money earned from the cartoons. So here's the Newman Theater. His friend, Iwerks, and other young men joined Walt in his new business. They spent the day drawing cartoons, making up jokes, and goofing around with a movie camera. Walt worked on one film called Alice's Wonderland. It was about a real little girl named Alice, played by a 4-year-old actress named Virginia Davis. Walt's Alice finds herself in a cartoon world. Mixing live characters with animation was something new. But before he finished Alice's Wonderland, Walt's company went bankrupt. He even had to sell his movie camera. Kansas City was not the center of the entertainment business. Walt knew that. If he wanted to make it big, he had better go where movies were made: Hollywood. So that is them making their cartoons. Chapter 5, Hollywood. After World War I, Hollywood became home to film studios such as Universal, Paramount, Warner Brothers, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM. Movies were now a big business. In August of 1923, Walt packed a cardboard suitcase with his clothes and drawing materials. He bought a train ticket to California, where his older brother Roy was already living. Walt moved in with an uncle, paying a few dollars a month for room and board. Walt had big dreams for himself, but he certainly didn't look like much of a success. He was stick thin and wore shabby clothing. He spiffed himself up as best as he could and went to every movie studio in town. Nobody offered him a job. So he went back to his old idea of making and selling cartoons. In October, he finally got a break. A woman named Margaret Winkler saw and liked what Walt had done in Alice's Wonderland. She agreed to pay Walt for a series of Alice cartoons, which she would sell to theaters. This was terrific news, except for one thing. Walt had only 3 months to make a new film. His young actress, Virginia Davis, still lived in Kansas City. Also, Walt needed money to make the movie. He didn't even have a movie camera. He didn't even have a movie camera, much less a studio or artist to work with him. Walt turned to his brother Roy for help. Roy was 8 years older than Walt. Unlike Walt, Roy was practical. He had a good head for business, so the two formed a Disney Brothers studio. With a loan from their uncle and some money from their parents, Walt and Roy set up shop in a small office on Kingswell Avenue. Walt bought himself a movie camera and he persuaded Virginia Davis and her family to move to Hollywood. At first, Walt did all the creative work in the studio. He thought up the story for each of the Alice movies. He directed his Star Child. He drew all the cartoon characters and put the live action and animation together. He worked so hard that his first film was finished ahead of schedule. But making a whole series of Alice films was too much work for one man. So Walt hired 3 men to operate the cameras and help with the animation. He also hired 3 women to ink and paint the black and white cartoons. So here is Lillian Bounds. I'm assuming that is one of the young women that he hired. Ooh, there you go. And this is Roy and Walt Disney. One of the young women was small and pretty with black hair. Her name was Lillian Bounds. There we go. Walt also worried that his own drawings were not good enough. He wanted his cartoon films to be the best in the business, so he got in touch with Ub Iwerks, whatever his name was. Walt convinced Ub to move out to California and join the Disney Army. Ub was talented and fast. He could produce great drawings in no time. Over the years, Ub did more and more of the drawings while Walt focused on thinking up the stories and directing. Together, they created a new character named Oswald and Lucky Rabbit and started making a series of Oswald cartoons. It was a smart decision. Oswald was a hit. The studio began selling cartoons on a regular basis. Business was so good, in fact, that Walt and Roy moved to bigger offices on a different avenue, and Walt changed the name of the company. Instead of Disney Brothers Studios, he wanted to call it Walt Disney Studios. So here's them drawing, and here's a picture of them drawing as well. Did Roy mind? It seems that he didn't. All Roy said was, if that's the way you want it, it was okay with him. After all, Walt was the one making the cartoons. Walt was under a lot of pressure now. He had to make lots of Oswald cartoons and do it quickly. He became short-tempered and irritable. He took his worries out on his employees. Some quit because they couldn't stand his insulting remarks. Walt could make you feel real bad when he wanted to, one of them said. Then something really nasty happened. Something Walt never expected and didn't deserve. A man named Charlie Mintz, whose company was buying Oswald the Lucky Rabbit cartoons, hired away most of Walt's artists. Mintz decided he didn't need Walt anymore. With Walt's own artists, he could make and sell Oswald cartoons without Walt Disney Studios. What Charlie Mintz did wasn't actually against the law, but it was still wrong. Walt was so upset that he couldn't eat or sleep. Not only had he lost Oswald, but he had been double-crossed. The only way he could save his business was to create another cartoon character, an even better one than Oswald. Walt worked like mad on a new idea and kept it secret. Only a few people, the people who did the drawings, Roy, who was always loyal to his brother, and Lillian, who inked the drawings, those were the people that knew about the new character. The new character was going to be a mouse. Who do you think the mouse is? Chapter 6. A mouse named Mickey. Lillian Bounds was from Idaho. She had moved to Hollywood in 1923. She was 26 years old. Her boss, Walt, liked her spunky nature. Her short, bobbed hair bounced when she laughed. Often, Walt would give Lillian a ride home after work. He was very proud of the new car he'd bought, a Ford Roadster. That's his car. The two got to know each other on those rides. Finally, Walt asked Lillian out on a date. He even said he'd buy himself a new suit for the occasion. Lillian agreed, and Walt went shopping. Confident as he often seemed, he was shy around girls. In fact, he was 22 and still didn't have a serious girlfriend. Walt showed up at Lillian's door dressed in a gray-green, double-breasted suit holding theater tickets. Lillian was charmed, and off they went. On July 13th, 1925, Walt and Lillian were married. They spent their honeymoon on Mount Rainier. On their wedding night, Walt had such a bad toothache that he couldn't sleep. To take his mind off the pain, he left their room and helped a porter shine shoes all night. The next morning, he went to a dentist and had his tooth pulled. It certainly wasn't the most fun way to start off a marriage, but Walt had a good story to tell. Lillian quit her job at the studio, but staying home was lonely. Walt spent such long hours at work. In later years, sometimes after dinner, Lillian would go back to the studio with Walt and go to sleep on a sofa while he kept on working. For Christmas, Walt decided to find a company for Lillian. He wrapped a big hat box with ribbon and presented it to her on Christmas morning. Expecting a hat, Lillian opened the box and out popped a furry orange puppy. She named it Sunny. Soon, Sunny went everywhere with her. As for Walt, he was just as crazy about Sunny as Lillian was. Every night, Walt would tell Lillian how his new cartoon character, was coming along. One story is that the mouse was first named Mortimer, but Lillian didn't like the name. It sounded too fancy. Instead, she suggested Mickey. So here's the dog, and here's him getting his tooth pulled out. No one can be sure if this story is exactly true. Walt often stretched the truth to make a story more interesting. But one way or another, the new cartoon character got the name Mickey Mouse. He was skinny with stick legs, a long tail, and a sharp face. He didn't look that much like the Mickey Mouse everyone knows today. He also wasn't as nice. Early cartoons starring Mickey Mouse often show him playing mean tricks on other characters. Like most movies and cartoons at that time, the first Mickey Mouse cartoon, called Plain Crazy, was silent and in black and white. In Plain Crazy, Mickey was a daredevil pilot who tries to impress his girlfriend, Minnie. The cartoon character came out not long after Charles Lindbergh became the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. So here's Mickey, and here's Charles Lindbergh. Lindenberg, sorry. Mickey Mouse is so hugely popular today that it's hard to believe that Walt had no luck selling his first two Mickey cartoons. But it's true. No theater wanted to show Walt's mouse cartoons. Never one to give up, Walt asked himself what would make Mickey more exciting. His answer was sound. The first movie with sound came out in 1927. It was called The Jazz Singer and starred a popular actor named Al Jolson. But as of yet, there had never been a character with sound. If Walt could do that, it would certainly grab the attention of audiences. In Steamboat Willie, Mickey Mouse whistles. His girlfriend Minnie says, "Yoo-hoo!" There was also music and other sound effects like doors slamming. Steamboat Willie was by far the best sound cartoon of its time. The manager of the Colony Theater in New York City agreed to show it, and the audiences loved it. Soon after, theaters started showing it. Walt quickly added soundtracks to his two earlier Mickey cartoons, and now was able to sell them in theaters as well. Here's them in the theater. Now something really surprising happened. Manager of a theater in Ocean Park, California, came up with a great gimmick. He invited kids to come to his theater and watch hours and hours of Mickey Mouse cartoons. All the kids who showed up became members of a club called the Mickey Mouse Club. There were pie-eating contests and marble tournaments for club members. Walt visited the theater one afternoon and watched 1,000 Mickey Mouse Club members screaming for their cartoon hero. Walt decided to start more clubs in other cities. Mickey Mouse clubs started to spring up all over America. At their meetings, kids recited the Mickey Mouse Club pledge. Mickey Mice do not swear, smoke, cheat, or lie. That was also a special club song. The Mickey Mouse Club made Mickey Mouse cartoons even more popular, and the cartoons made even more kids want to join a Mickey Mouse Club. So there they are, lining up for the theaters. Soon a Mickey Mouse cartoon strip, drawn by iWorks, was appearing in 40 newspapers around the country. Kids went crazy, buying Mickey Mouse dolls, buttons, pencils, toothbrushes, and books. Walt had done something new, something big, just as he always hoped he would, and it was just the beginning. So here's his newspaper. Walt Disney, and we're going to pick up on chapter 7, Ups and Downs. So Walt Disney was on top of the world when trouble hit the studio again. A dishonest distributor wanted control of Mickey Mouse. Walt lost Oswald. He was not going to let Mickey get away. Roy worked out a deal so that Disney's kept ownership of Mickey. The distributor, however, did manage to hire away iWorks. Why did he leave? Ub said that Walt always was complaining about the work Ub did, and Walt liked to take all the credit for Disney cartoons. According to Ub, Walt couldn't even draw a proper Mickey Mouse. One time, a boy begged Walt for a drawing of Mickey with Walt's autograph. Walt asked Ub to draw it, and then Walt would sign it. Ub got so mad that he told Walt to draw it himself and stomped off. Losing Ub was hard. Walt was angry and hurt, but he hired new animators to join his team. They quickly realized that Walt was the most important man in the studio, even if he didn't do the drawing. He chose what cartoons to make. He worked on the studio development and artwork. He made all the final decisions. If the new animators didn't like it, they had to keep quiet or quit. In the early 1930s, Walt Disney Studios produced many short cartoons called Silly Symphonies. As always, Walt wanted to do something new. Three Little Pigs had much more of a plot. The story of the pigs and the hungry wolf came from The Green Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. It was Walt's idea to put it in a song. It was called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? People came out of theaters whistling the peppy tune. The song seemed to cheer people up. Three Little Pigs came out in 1933. Many people needed cheering up. It was a time called the Great Depression. Thousands of companies had gone out of business. Millions of workers lost their jobs. People lost their homes. So here's the Three Little Pigs in the theater. Fewer families had money to spend on extras like going to movie theaters, but Walt Disney Studios was doing fine. By 1930, a company called Technicolor was producing good color film for movies. Walt is said to have announced, "At last, we can show a rainbow on the screen." Walt's Flowers and Trees, about two trees who fall in love, was the first cartoon in full color. It won an Academy Award. Everyone at Disney worked long hours, but nobody worked harder than Walt. He drove himself to the point of collapse. He was exhausted and more moody than ever. He was also upset because he and Lillian were having trouble having children. Walt worried that he might never be a father. He couldn't sleep at night. He often cried. He became so sick that his doctor insisted he'd take a long vacation to recover from stress. In the fall of 1931, Walt and Lillian took a train all across the country to Washington, D.C. All right, I'll stop there so you can look at the pictures. There's Walt and Lillian, and here is the train. Being on a train was always relaxing and fun for Walt. They took a boat trip through the Panama Canal. He and Lillian lounged on deck chairs and had romantic dinners. When the Disneys returned home, Walt took up sports to ease stress: ice skating, swimming, horseback riding, and polo. In 1933, Lillian became pregnant. Walt was thrilled. He wrote his family about all of the pink and blue baby items in the nursery. On December 18th, a healthy baby girl was born, Diane Marie Disney. Lillian could not have any more children after Diane. So, in 1937, the Disneys adopted a baby girl and named her Sharon May. So here's the Panama Canal, and here's the Disneys with their baby Diane. Walt did everything he could to give his daughters a happy home life, and he always had a movie camera in his hand to record family fun. He read to his girls, took them on outings, acted stories for them, and took them bike riding at the studio. So there's him videoing. He even built a giant playhouse for them that looked like it was made for Snow White. As for fancy Hollywood parties, Walt had no interest in them. He liked staying home, eating chili and beans on crackers. Roy and his wife and son lived nearby. The two families saw a lot of each other. Walt's parents, however, were still living far away in Portland, Oregon. So Walt and Roy decided to buy a house in California for them. The Disneys could get all together for backyard barbecues. The house was a wonderful gift, meant to bring joy. Instead, it brought terrible sorrow. There was something wrong with the heating system. Suddenly, one day in 1938, Elias and Flora became sick from breathing in poisonous gas that was leaking. Elias recovered, but sadly, Flora died. Walt was so upset that for the rest of his life, he refused to talk about his mother's death. All right, Chapter 8, Snow White. Walt Disney was always looking for the next big idea. He was always pushing the boundaries of what could be done in a cartoon. He and his artists perfected sound and color. Walt didn't stop there. In 1933, he decided to make a full-length animated film. Up until then, cartoons were short. They lasted only a few minutes. In theaters, they were shown before a full-length movie. Yet Walt knew that kids would sit watching hours of different Mickey Mouse cartoons. So why wouldn't they sit through one long animated movie if it was good enough? Besides being short, cartoons were always full of slapstick gags. A full-length animated movie, however, needed more than humor. Walt had to have a story with romance and drama and excitement. The famous fairy tale Snow White had all of that. It was the story Walt picked. It took years to create Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. More than 250,000 drawings were done for the 83-minute movie. Walt was in charge of every step of production. At meetings, he acted out scenes for his animation team. The artists copied Walt's expressions and movements into their drawings. He wanted each character to seem as real as a live character. Yes, there would be funny scenes, but there would also be parts where people would cry or hold their breath in fear. The backgrounds were important too. They could not look flat and two-dimensional. For example, the House of the Seven Dwarfs had to look as if it were solid and in real space. A special multi-plane camera also helped make everything look three-dimensional. Disney artists spent more than 3 years making Snow White. One spent almost a year drawing a funny scene of the dwarfs eating soup. And it didn't even end up in the movie. Roy had one of the hardest jobs. He had to come up with the money to make Snow White. The studio borrowed more than $1.5 million. This was an incredible sum of money for a cartoon. But what if the film flopped? How would the studio pay it back? So there's them drawing the dwarfs, and here's the theater. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs opened on December 21st, 1937. The Carthay, excuse my mispronunciation, the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles. Famous Hollywood stars came dressed in every exciting gown and tuxedo. The audience gasped at the beauty of the film. At the end, the applause was like thunder. Time magazine put Walt on the cover and called Snow White a masterpiece. Walt won a special Academy Award. It had a golden Oscar surrounded by 7 smaller Oscars. So there's them in their gowns. Over the next few years, Disney produced 3 more wonderful movies in animation: Fantasia, Pinocchio, and Bambi. However, none matched the film magic of Snow White. To this day, it remains one of the most popular movies ever made. So there's Fantasia, there's Pinocchio, and there's Bambi. Chapter 9, The Strike. Snow White made so much money that Roy and Walt bought 51 acres of land for a new studio in Burbank, California. So here's California. And Burbank is right here beside Los Angeles. In 1940, everyone moved into the complex. The company was now a big business. There were hundreds of employees. The animators worked in one building, and inkers, painters, and special effects artists worked in another. Walt thought that his employees would be happy to leave their old, cramped spaces and work in modern, air-conditioned buildings. But he was wrong. In the old days, all the Disney employees worked closely together and felt like family. Now they were separated from each other. People rarely saw Walt. There were complaints that the studio felt like a big factory. On top of that, once again, the studio was having money trouble. A lot of money came from selling Disney cartoons to theaters in countries all over Europe. But since 1939, World War II, had began raging in Europe. The market for Disney's films there dried up. So Roy had to cut wages, and this made employees angry. They said they would stop working if Walt and Roy didn't listen to their complaints. Walt held a meeting and tried to calm people down. It didn't work. So here's Walt Disney Studios. And here is the strike. It says Disney Studios on strike, Snow White and 700 Dwarves, Are We Mice or Men? Is what some of their signs say. On May 29th, 1941, hundreds of Disney workers went on strike. That meant I'm not sure what happened to the video, but I'll pick up on the page where I was. On May 29th, 1941, hundreds of Disney workers went on strike. That meant they refused to work until their demands were met. They stood outside the studio entrance, shouting at anyone who dared go to work. When Walt drove up each morning, workers screamed and banged on his car. The strike lasted 9 weeks. It upset Walt terribly. He believed that the Disney studio had always been fair to employees. He felt betrayed. His health suffered again from all the stress. In early August, he went to South America. While he was away, Roy settled with the strike leaders. The employees got their pay demands. But the strike changed Walt. He refused to see any of the workers had honest complaints. He was very bitter. Then in September, his father, Elias, died. Now both Walt's parents were gone, and his next full-length cartoon, Dumbo, about a flying elephant, was not the success Walt was hoping for. It came out in October of 1941. Everything changed at the studio after December 7th, 1941. That was when the Japanese army bombed an American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Now the United States was in the war too. American soldiers were fighting on two fronts, in the Pacific and in Europe. The U.S. Army took over Walt's studio. Training films for soldiers were needed. So here is a picture of, I'm assuming, them making a deal for the strike. And here's a picture of Walt. Walt had a hard time feeling creative during this time of work. Walt used Donald Duck in several cartoons for the U.S. Army. In one, Donald plays a skinny American soldier who becomes a hero. In another film, Donald Duck is living a miserable life in Nazi Germany. At the end, it turns out to be a bad dream. Donald wakes up safe and happy in the United States. This kind of film was to make Americans feel proud of their country. So here's him drawing cartoons. The war ended in 1945. Walt could now go back to making his own movies. Several live-action adventure movies came out, but audiences didn't like Treasure Island, Swiss Family Robinson, or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, as much as they had liked Snow White. One Disney movie, Song of the South, made many people angry. The main character is an old African-American man named Uncle Remus, who lived on a southern plantation. The NAACP, an early civil rights organization, felt the movie made the lives of slaves seem happy, even though the film was set after the Civil War had ended. Black Americans were very upset. Critics said Walt was out of touch. Walt turned to making nature films like Seal Island, stories that filmed real animals but had a made-up story. Walt did not pour his heart into these films the way he had with his classics. Maybe making movies was starting to bore him a little. Excuse me. Or maybe it was because Walt was already thinking about the next big thing. Here is Walt and the seal. And I'm assuming this is a person from the NAACP, or it's someone from the movie. I'm not 100% sure. That's just my assumption. Alright, Chapter 10, A Fantasy World. In some ways, Walt Disney always remained a kid at heart. When he took his daughters to the merry-go-round in Griffith Park, he'd get on a horse and ride too. At home, Walt spent hours tinkering with wind-up toys and model trains. He even had a real little railroad built in his big backyard. On weekends, Walt put on an engineer's cap. He'd take his daughters and friends on a ride. Afterward, he'd whip up a goopy banana splits that nobody could finish. It was good, wholesome fun. Here's the merry-go-round right here. There you go. And here is his railroad system in his backyard. Could you imagine having a little train in your backyard? I think that would be nuts. And here's his banana splits. That started Walt's thinking. What if there were a place where families, not just kids, could go and have fun together? It would be like an amusement park, only cleaner, different, better. It would have a village like Marceline, Missouri. Stores would sell Disney clothes and toys. There would be a little railroad, a movie theater, and rides. Lots of rides. Roy wasn't wild about the Disneyland idea. "Who will pay for it?" he asked, but Walt already had the answer. Television had always fascinated Walt. He saw that it was the next big thing. All through the 1920s and 1930s, people turned into popular radio shows, but you could only listen to the radio. You couldn't see anything. Television brought about the end of radio shows. Many filmmakers also thought of TV as the enemy. The little screen was taking away the audience from big screen pictures. Not Walt. He saw TV as another way to entertain people. He thought that in return for a Disney TV show, a network would invest in his theme park. Walt was right. Here's the radio. ABC started running a show that featured Disney cartoons and some live-action skits. It was a big hit. The only show that was more popular was I Love Lucy, starring the comedian Lucille Ball. Walt was the host of the show. He talked to viewers in a friendly, grandfather-y way. Before long, kids all knew Walt Disney's face. He was a star. The Mickey Mouse Club was another hit for ABC. Please excuse my cat in the background. He really wants in my room, and he knows that he can just push the door open. In every episode, there was always a newsreel, a cartoon, and songs and dances performed by a group of young actors called Mouseketeers. So here's the television, and here is the Mickey Mouse Club. The first show aired in 1955. For many years, it ran 5 days a week. He also created a Western Ministries... He also created a Western miniseries called Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett was a real-life frontiersman from Tennessee who lived in the early 1800s. To play Davy, Walt chose a good-looking young actor named Fess Parker. There were only 3 episodes of Davy Crockett, but every kid wanted a coonskin hat like Davy's. Every kid knew the words to the theme song. The studio made a lot of money in television. Television helped Walt build his Disneyland dream. As with all of the other Disney projects, Walt was in control. He loved working on the theme park. If he wanted to create a jungle, he did. If a lake wasn't big enough, he made it bigger. Disneyland opened on July 17, 1955, in California. Just 4 days earlier, he and Lillian had their 30th wedding anniversary. Opening day did not go smoothly. Crowds stood in line in 100-degree heat. Some of the rides weren't working. The train didn't lead anywhere. It came to a dead end. There were not enough trash cans or water fountains. But Walt had things fixed right away. Soon, the place was spotless. Everyone who worked there was polite and cheerful. They had to go to Disney University to learn exactly how to behave towards visitors. So here's Davy Crockett. And here is the kids with their coonskin hats. People all over the world were flocking to Disneyland. They could spend time in Fantasyland with its fairy tale castle and fairy tale characters in costume. They could look for hippos and other wild animals in Adventureland or ride on the Mark Twain riverboat. There was Main Street that looked very much like the one in Missouri. So here is the castle. And here is the teacups. Walt enjoyed Disneyland as much as anyone, but he had to disguise himself in a floppy hat and sunglasses or else fans would mob him. Sometimes a child still recognized him. Walt would put his finger to his lips and secretly slip the child an autograph. After hours, Walt had Disneyland all to himself. He drove a mini fire engine through the streets or relaxed in his private apartment over the firehouse on Main Street. Already, he was thinking about the next big thing, a city of the future. Walt's plans for Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, included monorails and underground roads to keep children safe from cars. City streets would be designed to look like different places from around the world. It would be just the kind of place Walt would want to live himself. So here's him sneaking autographs. And here's him on the fire engine. All right, chapter 11, the final act. Some men slow down as they age, but not Walt Disney. He had too many ideas to quit working. In 1964, a giant World's Fair was held outside of New York City. Some of the best exhibits were designed by Walt Disney. One was called Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. An Abraham Lincoln robot got up from a chair. He looked left and right at his audience. Then he shifted his weight from one foot to another and recited a speech about liberty. The robot looked so real that people thought it was an actor. Walt didn't spend much time at the studio anymore. Making movies didn't interest him. Diane and Sharon were both married. Those were his daughters, remember? Walt and Lillian became regular babysitters for their grandchildren. Walt loved having a house full of little children again. He often sat on his lawn and watched his wild bunch pile up patio furniture to make backyard forts and rocket ships. He let the kids spend the night at Disneyland and explore it when nobody else was around. And he put some of them into Disney films just for fun. In July of 1966, Walt and Lillian celebrated their 41st anniversary. So here is the Lincoln robot. And here is him making forts with his grandchildren. So they just celebrated their 41st anniversary. They took the whole family on a cruise to British Columbia. Walt wasn't feeling well, but he enjoyed being with his grandchildren. He let them crawl all over him. When he got tired, he climbed to the upper deck to think. He'd think about Epcot. After the trip, Walt didn't get better. Medical tests discovered something very serious. Walt had lung cancer. Walt had smoked cigarettes since his days in France. Until 1964, however, people did not know that smoking caused cancer. While Walt was in the hospital, Roy came for a visit. He found Walt staring at the ceiling. Walt pointed out where everyone was going to go at Epcot. The next day, December 15th, 1966, he died. Walt Disney was 65 years old. He did not live to see the opening of Walt Disney World in Florida in 1971, but Roy was there. He waited to retire until Walt Disney World was completed. Walt Disney has been gone for a long time. However, he is still entertaining people through Disney books, records, movies, toys, and his parks all over the world, where each year millions of families come with one idea: to have fun. So here's him on the ship, and here's him in his hospital bed, I'm assuming. Alright, that is the end of our story. So what did you learn about who was Walt Disney? I learned that he was an ambulance driver in France during World War I. I had no idea. I thought he just jumped right into always making cartoons. I thought that was pretty cool. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this story because I found it very interesting. I learned a lot about Walt Disney that I did not know. Alright, that concludes our Disney week. Bye guys.